Dear friends and followers, thanks for tuning into my aviation world. This is your host Asad, and today I am here back with a new exciting topic: how passengers can tell a difference between an Airbus and a Boeing. As airplanes look more and more similar these days, so it gets hard for the passengers to identify what type of plane they are going to spot or travel in. So don't spend hours on studying the differences in between them. So today in this video I will show you how you can spot the different type of planes and can identify them easily by using some easy visual references. So without wasting any time, let's get started.
Tip. 1383, runway 27, clear takeoff. United 1538.
Okay, let's start with the cockpit windscreen. If you notice the different types of aircrafts of Boeing and an Airbus, you can see the significant amount of difference in between the cockpit windows, especially the side windows. So if you look at an Airbus A320 side windows, you can easily identify and can spot that the side windows of the cockpit of an Airbus A320 is at right angle, and it gives it almost a square shape. In comparison to Boeing 737, you will notice that the side windows of the Boeing 737 is converged in a V shape. So it is an easiest way to spot the difference between these two commonly used aircrafts. So the second way to identify the difference between the aircrafts of two best manufacturers, Airbus and a Boeing, is looking at the nose of aircrafts. Airbus A320 have a much rounded nose compared to the Boeing 737 pointing nose, which from the side perspective is almost as a shape of triangle. Airbus is much rounder in shape while Boeing is much sleeker. Depending on what view you have of an aircraft, especially for the Airbus A320 family and Boeing 737 family, you can easily identify them by looking at the shape of its engine. So you can notice the cowling shape of engine of Airbus is perfectly rounded. However, with the Boeing, you can notice the bottom of engine of aircraft is not perfectly circular and it is almost flat. So in order to identify some specific type of aircraft, we will go into the detail of the specific iconic one. How to tell the difference between Airbus A330 and a Boeing 777, which are almost similar in shape, size and range, and some airlines operate both of these aircraft. So the easiest way to identify it is by looking at the number of wheels. A Boeing 777 has a triple bogie, and by giving a look at the main gear section of A330, you will notice it has only double bogie. However, don't get it mixed with the Airbus A350, which also has a triple bogie. For this, you have to take a look at the wingtips, which have sharp curves, which 777 doesn't come with. Airbus has sharklets, Boeing have winglets. Do not mix them. So let's move on to the big and heavier ones. How to identify the difference between an Airbus A380 and a Boeing 747. It is easiest to identify. All you have to do here is take a quick look, and if it is big, beautiful, gorgeous and looks very elegant, you have your answer straight away because it is Boeing 747. Jokes aside, these both aircrafts are four-engine aircraft, and the easiest way to identify them is by looking at the upper deck of aircraft. And you will see all 747 models have a famous sound which the Airbus A380 don't have. How to identify the Airbus A330 and Boeing 767? The easiest and simplest way to identify them is while giving them a look when they are coming for landing. And you will notice the landing gear of A330 is tilted backward while the landing gear of Boeing 767 is tilted forward. So some of these features will help you to identify what type of aircraft you are flying on. Either it is a Boeing or an Airbus. Share this video with your friends and family, and that's it for today, and thank you so much for your precious time. Here is your checklist. Like my video, check. Comment my video, check. Share my video, check. Push the bell icon, check. Subscribe to my channel, check. Follow my Instagram, check. See you soon in the next video. Stay home, stay safe. Your host, Asad Shabir.